The pristine white linen of the dining table was perfect, until a single drop of blood from Evelyn's lip hit the porcelain. Across the room, the charismatic Pastor Thomas adjusted his silk tie in the mirror. His reflection, a mask of holy devotion that didn't match the cold, predatory weight of the hand he just leveled against her. In the heavy silence of the Victorian mansion, the only sound was the frantic, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock and the muffled whimpers of their son hiding under the mahogany table. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she reached into the dark recesses of her husband's private desk, her skin crawling with the scent of his peppermint breath still lingering in the air. A hidden panel groaned open, revealing not a Bible, but a thick, black-bound ledger filled with names of the dead and numbers that didn't add up. Outside, the gravel crunched. Thomas was back earlier than expected, as the heavy front door lock turned with a definitive, metallic snap. Evelyn realized the man the world worshipped was a monster, and she was currently holding the only evidence that could keep her alive. Evelyn Harper smoothed the pristine white linen of the dining table, her fingertips tracing the invisible seams with a precision born of necessity. The air in the stifling kitchen carried the heavy, cloying scent of freshly ground Arabica and the salt-sweet aroma of frying bacon, a domestic perfume that struggled to mask the sharper, chemical tang of lemon furniture polish. She arranged the omelets on the bone china plates, her movements mechanical as she ensured the sprigs of parsley lay in perfect parallel lines against the gilded rims. Perspiration prickled her skin beneath the rigid, unyielding fabric of her Sunday dress, a damp heat that made the high collar feel like a tightening noose. Yet she merely pressed her lips into a bloodless line. She adjusted the heavy silver cutlery, checking the symmetry against the floral patterns of the rug. Every object in this Victorian mausoleum had to remain frozen, a still life prepared for the scrutiny of the congregation. Evelyn forced her palms to flatten against the mahogany surface, willing the tremors to subside as the rhythmic, heavy thud of her husband's footsteps echoed from the staircase, signaling the curtain rise on their weekly performance of The Perfect American Family. Thomas Harper circled the table with the slow, predatory grace of a man who owned the air he breathed, his polished leather Oxfords creaking against the dark oak floorboards. He came to a halt directly behind Evelyn, and she instinctively pulled her head toward her shoulders, a turtle retreating into a shell of silk and bone. Thomas's fingers, cold and dry as parchment, brushed a stray chestnut lock from the nape of her neck. He leaned down, his mouth inches from her ear, and she caught the sharp, medicinal scent of peppermint on his breath. He murmured a critique about the untidiness of her hair, his voice a dry rasp that reminded her of dead leaves skittering across a tombstone. In the distorted reflection of the silver coffee urn, Evelyn watched her own pallid face and the steely, unblinking glint in Thomas's eyes. He squeezed her shoulder, his grip tightening until the pressure bypassed discomfort and became a clear, sharp warning. And Evelyn lowered her gaze to the floor, silently acknowledging his absolute dominion over every breath she took. Isaac reached for the crystal pitcher of orange juice, his small, pale fingers fumbling against the condensation on the glass. The heavy vessel slipped, shattering against the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot, sending shards of glass and bright orange droplets spraying across the Persian rug. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Thomas shoved his chair back, the wooden legs shrieking against the stone floor in a jarring protest. A dark, angry flush crept up Thomas's neck, his veins bulging like thick, twisted cords beneath his skin. He clenched his fists until the knuckles turned a ghostly white. Isaac huddled into a small ball on his chair, his eyes wide and glassy with a terror no child should recognize. The atmosphere around Thomas vibrated with a raw, kinetic fury, and Evelyn saw the heavy arc of his hand as it rose, poised to strike the boy with the full weight of his righteous indignation. Evelyn lunged, her feet crunching over the jagged remains of the pitcher. She threw herself over Isaac, shielding his head and chest with her own fragile frame. Thomas's heavy fist descended, striking Evelyn's forearm with a sickening, dull thud that stole the air from her lungs. A white-hot agony flared across her skin, a searing brand that made her vision swim. She pulled Isaac closer, his frantic, bird-like heartbeat thumping against her ribs through the thin cotton of his shirt. Evelyn refused to make a sound, grinding her teeth together as Thomas towered over them, his breath coming in ragged, animalistic bursts. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the next blow, feeling nothing but the cold sweat trickling down her temple and the violent, uncontrollable shivering of the boy beneath her hands. Thomas adjusted the stiff cuffs of his white shirt and pulled on his charcoal blazer, his eyes sliding over Isaac's muffled whimpers as if the boy were a broken piece of furniture. He cast a frigid, dismissive look at Evelyn while he perfected the knot of his silk tie in the hallway mirror. He issued a sharp command for her to conceal the bruising and prepare for the afternoon reception, his voice carrying the icy promise of further retribution should she fail. The heavy front door slammed shut with a thunderous boom that vibrated through the very foundation of the house. Evelyn heard the low growl of Thomas's car engine and the crunch of gravel as the tires bit into the driveway. A ringing, hollow void filled the rooms. Evelyn stood alone amidst the ruins of the breakfast, staring at the spreading juice stains and the glass, while the fading hum of the car vanished into the morning mist, leaving her stranded in the wreckage of her own fear. The metallic click of the bathroom bolt sounded like a reprieve to Evelyn's ears. She peeled the dress away from her skin, revealing the angry, plum-colored mark blooming across her shoulder. Cold water hissed from the faucet, filling the small space with a cloud of steam and a dull, white noise. She pressed a cloth filled with ice to the injury, staring at her reflection in the fogged glass of the vanity. In her own gray-blue eyes, she saw the walls of her gilded cage beginning to contract, the Victorian elegance of the room transforming into a collection of gilded torture implements. She realized that the sparkle of the crystal and the softness of the wallpaper could no longer mask the scent of internal rot. Her fingers gripped the porcelain rim of the sink until they turned numb, as the realization of the lethal threat Thomas posed finally pierced through her practiced denial. Evelyn crept down the hallway, her weight light to avoid the treacherous groans of the floorboards. Her hand hovered, trembling, over the heavy oak handle of Thomas's study. She knew the absolute prohibition he placed on this room, but the terror for Isaac's future outweighed the instinct for self-preservation. The door yielded with a faint, rhythmic groan of the hinges. She inhaled the stale atmosphere of old leather and expensive tobacco that defined Thomas's private world. Thin shafts of sunlight pierced the heavy velvet curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny ghosts in the air. She frantically sifted through the stacks of folders on the massive desk, searching for the deed to the house or any shred of financial independence. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and every sigh of the wind outside became the sound of Thomas returning to catch her in his sanctuary. Her fingers trailed over the spines of the leather-bound books in the massive mahogany case. A desperate, random pressure on the spine of a thick theological volume triggered a sharp, mechanical click. A section of the shelving swung inward with a silent, heavy grace, revealing a hidden alcove. Inside the wall, Evelyn saw a steel safe with a digital keypad, its gray face looking alien against the Victorian woodwork. The cold metal bit into her fingertips as she touched the door. She spotted a small scrap of paper with a series of numbers taped to the interior of the wooden panel. Her breathing became shallow and jagged as she began to punch in the code. The heavy thud of the internal bolts retracting sounded like a thunderclap in the silent room. opening the path to the secrets Thomas had spent a decade burying. Evelyn pulled a heavy, black-bound ledger from the depths of the safe. She flipped through the yellowed pages, her eyes skimming the meticulous, aggressive handwriting that characterized Thomas's private records. She saw columns of figures and the names of the very parishioners who looked to him for salvation. She tracked dates of significant donations and the corresponding sums that never made it to the church's building fund or the local orphanage. The entries revealed a systematic pattern of embezzlement stretching back 10 years. A wave of nausea rose in her throat as she read Thomas's casual notes regarding personal expenses funded by the life savings of widows. Her fingers shook, wrinkling the edges of the paper. Every line in the book dismantled the image of the holy man, leaving only a calculating thief. And Evelyn knew she held the death warrant of their marriage in her hands. Deeper in the safe, she found a thick envelope containing bank statements bearing the stamps of foreign institutions. She studied the confirmations of wire transfers. Hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled into offshore accounts in Panama and the Cayman Islands. Thomas's bold signature sat at the bottom of every transaction, a black-inked testament to the scale of his betrayal. She saw the charts of his growing shadow empire, while the local community struggled to repair the church roof or feed the needy. The rustle of the paper seemed deafening in the tomb-like silence of the study. Evelyn realized Thomas wasn't merely a household tyrant. He was an international fraudster using the pulpit as a shield. Rage and a cold, paralyzing horror warred in her chest as she understood exactly how their mansion and her silk dresses had been purchased. The sudden, low rumble of an engine on the driveway made Evelyn bolt upright. She stole a glance through the curtains and saw Thomas's black sedan turning through the iron gates. Panic flared in her chest, but she forced her limbs to move with a frantic, calculated speed. She shoved the ledger and the wire transfers back into the safe, slamming the heavy door shut. She reset the books, the hidden panel clicking back into place just as she heard the front door lock turn. She smoothed her skirt and slipped out of the study, her heart a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs as the shadow of her husband fell across the hallway floor. Evelyn gripped the tiny, ridged plastic of the recording device, the edges digging into the soft flesh of her palm. She knelt on the floor of the nursery, a room that smelled of lavender and baby powder, a stark contrast to the darkness she carried. She picked up a worn teddy bear, its fur matted and one ear hanging by a thread, and used a small razor blade to carefully open the seam along its belly. White stuffing billowed out like a cloud of synthetic snow. She shoved the dictaphone deep into the plush interior, burying it beneath the cotton batting. Her fingers trembled as she used a needle and thread to close the hole, her stitches small and frantic, hoping the repair would go unnoticed. She placed the bear back on the shelf, and its glass eyes seemed to watch her with a silent, knowing judgment. Thomas stood atop a stepladder, his movements precise as he screwed black, hemispherical camera domes into the ornate plaster of the ceiling. Evelyn watched from the shadows as he blew a fine dusting of white powder from his fingertips. In the study, a massive monitor flickered to life. The screen divided into 12 cold, gray squares. Evelyn saw her own distorted image on the display, a ghost caught in a wide-angle lens. Thomas turned his head slowly toward her, his face on the screen mirroring the predatory smirk he wore in the flesh. The low, constant hum of the servers filled the room. Thomas tapped a finger against the glass, drawing her attention to the fact that every corner of the house was now under his unblinking surveillance. Thomas opened the heavy cast-iron door of the fireplace, the orange glow of the embers casting long, dancing shadows across his face. Evelyn watched as he pulled her driver's license from his wallet. He held the plastic card over the licking flames, and she watched her own smiling face on the ID bubble blacken and curl into a charred, unrecognizable lump. The acrid stench of burning plastic filled the room, stinging her eyes. Thomas pointedly dropped the car keys into the deep pocket of his trousers, the metallic jingle sounding like the final turn of a prison lock. Evelyn pressed her hands against her thighs, the cold realization hitting her that the mansion was now a fortress, and her only path to the outside world had been severed. Evelyn moved through the labyrinthine stacks of the town library, the air thick with the scent of decaying paper and old adhesive. She turned into the furthest reaches of the reference section, where the light from the overhead lamps struggled to penetrate the gloom. Sarah, the librarian, waited by a dusty window, her hands nervously tracing the edges of a heavy book. Evelyn felt the damp heat of sweat soaking into the collar of her blouse. She reached into her purse and retrieved the folded, grainy photocopies of Thomas's ledger. The sound of the paper unfolding felt like a landslide in the pressurized silence of the library. She cast a desperate look at Sarah, whose lips moved in a silent prayer as Evelyn handed over the evidence of the pastor's crimes. From behind a towering shelf of theological texts, the tall, thin silhouette of the pastor's assistant emerged. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, the light reflecting off the lenses to hide his eyes. He moved with a silent, practiced tread across the carpeted floor, trailing Evelyn and Sarah like a shadow. Evelyn caught the flicker of his movement among the book spines and felt a sudden, icy chill race down her spine. The assistant paused by a rack of periodicals, pretending to study a cover, but his head was tilted, straining to catch the frantic whispers of their conversation. Evelyn saw him clenching a cell phone in his hand, a digital tether ready to alert Thomas to her every movement and every word. Evelyn pressed the tiny flash drive into Sarah's palm, the movement hidden by the heavy sleeve of her coat. Sarah vanished the device into the deep pocket of her apron, just as the assistant stepped out from behind the shelves, blocking Evelyn's path to the exit. He placed a heavy, proprietary hand on her shoulder, the smell of stale tobacco clinging to his wool coat. He spoke her name with a soft, practiced menace, informing her that Thomas was already waiting for her at the library entrance. Evelyn watched as Sarah retreated into the shadows of the stacks, her eyes wide with fear. She was forced to follow the assistant toward the door, feeling the weight of his unblinking stare between her shoulder blades like a physical blow. Thomas ripped the pillowcases from the bed in their master suite, sending a blizzard of white feathers swirling through the air. Evelyn stood paralyzed in the doorway, watching as he dumped the contents of her dresser drawers onto the floor. The delicate silk and lace of her undergarments tore under his rough, searching fingers. He heaved the mattress upward, the heavy thud against the wooden frame making her flinch. His breathing was thick and animalistic as he searched for the documents he knew she had taken. Evelyn watched as he swept a porcelain jewelry box from the vanity, the shattered pieces skittering across the floor and scarring the polished legs of the furniture. He turned to her, his eyes burning with a frantic, desperate need to find the evidence of his own undoing. Thomas grabbed the teddy bear from the shelf and hurled it with a violent grunt into the corner of the room. The toy struck the wall and landed face down on the hardwood. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she spotted a single white thread dangling from the bear's stomach. Thomas didn't notice. He was already kicking through a pile of her clothes, his face contorted with frustration. He didn't spare the toy a second glance. Evelyn held her breath, terrified that the frantic thumping of her own heart would reveal the secret hidden in the plush fur. Thomas wiped the sweat from his brow and stormed out of the bedroom, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her eyes fixed on the bear in the corner, knowing the dictaphone inside was still silently recording the aftermath of his rage. Thomas sliced into a thick, rare steak at the dinner table, the red juices pooling into the white porcelain of his plate. Between bites, he raised a glass of dark wine and announced that, following the church jubilee, The family would be moving to the Green River estate. Evelyn knew the property, a secluded, decaying house an hour from the nearest town, buried in the dense, lightless pine forests of the north. Thomas described the silence and the spiritual purification that awaited her, his voice carrying the finality of a judge passing sentence. Isaac picked at his food, his head bowed, avoiding his father's gaze. Evelyn felt the walls of the dining room begin to press inward. Thomas smiled at her, a cold, bared-teeth expression that promised a total isolation where no one would ever hear her scream. Evelyn pressed the telephone receiver to her ear, desperate to hear the voice of Sheriff Miller. Through the living room window, she watched as a patrol car pulled up to the iron gates. The sheriff stepped out, his uniform crisp, and headed toward the porch where Thomas was already waiting. She saw Thomas lean in, placing a familiar hand on the lawman's shoulder and whispering something that made them both break into a loud, companionable laugh. Miller slapped Thomas on the back, and the two men entered the house together like old friends. Evelyn slowly lowered the receiver back onto the cradle, the realization hitting her that the law in this town wore the same face as her husband. Her hope for help vanished beneath the sound of their shared, masculine mirth. Evelyn stood by the window of her small study, staring at the darkening tree line that marked the edge of their land. She imagined the Green River estate, a place of marshes and ancient, suffocating trees. She realized Thomas had already begun the work, sowing rumors of her fragile mental state among the women of the congregation. In the wilderness he had chosen, any cry for help would be dismissed as another episode of her supposed hysteria. She saw her own pale, haunted reflection in the glass, and knew Thomas was planning a final solution. A hunting accident or a tragic fall where there would be no witnesses. A cold, sharp clarity pierced through her fear. In those woods, Thomas wouldn't need cameras to keep her silent. Evelyn pressed the phone to her ear, but the only sound was a flat, electronic void. The metallic voice of a recording repeated a sterile message about the line being disconnected. She ran toward the town library, but her heart sank when she saw the fresh, raw pine boards nailed in a jagged cross over the heavy oak doors. The smell of sawdust and resin was sharp in the humid air. Through the gaps in the wood, she saw only overturned chairs and a thick layer of dust settling in the empty lobby. A notice about an emergency renovation, taped to the glass, fluttered in the wind. Evelyn yanked at the handle, but it remained motionless, leaving only the cold stain of rust on her palms. Sarah was gone, and with her, the last bridge to the world outside had been burned. Her fingers frantically dialed the long-distance number for the lawyer in Chicago, a sequence of digits scribbled on a crumpled napkin. She huddled in the dark space beneath the stairs, gripping the handset until her knuckles turned white. Instead of a ringtone, she heard only a mechanical rasp and a monotone operator stating the number was no longer in service. She tried again, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But the sequence of numbers felt cursed. Every attempt to reach beyond the gates of the estate was met with a wall of electronic silence. A cold dread slithered down her spine as she realized the house's phone lines were now a closed loop, entirely under Thomas's thumb. She dropped the useless receiver, which hit the carpet with a dull, final thud. The bathroom door shuddered under a massive impact, the wood splintering as it flew off its hinges and slammed into the tiled wall. Thomas stood in the opening, his chest heaving with a wet, whistling sound. He hurled a damp, crumpled piece of paper onto the wet floor. The ledger page Evelyn had hidden behind the bottles of antiseptic. She watched as the ink began to bleed into the grout under the dripping faucet. Thomas stepped into the small room, his shadow swallowing her where she huddled against the sink. His eyes were narrowed into slits of frozen fury. She saw the muscles in his jaw working as he slowly wrapped the silk belt of her robe around his fist, the fabric straining under his strength. Thomas grabbed a handful of Evelyn's hair, and a sharp, blinding pain forced her head back. He dragged her across the polished wood of the hallway, ignoring her desperate attempts to find purchase on the door frames. She caught a glimpse of Isaac, who had crawled into the shadows behind the grandfather clock, his small hands pressed over his face. The boy's muffled sobs were drowned out by the heavy, rhythmic thud of Thomas's boots. The stone steps of the basement stairs bit into her ribs and thighs as he hauled her down. She tried to scream, but he tightened his grip on her scalp, forcing a gasp of agony from her throat. The smell of damp earth and rot rose to meet her as he dragged her into the dark. Thomas shoved Evelyn into the cramped, dark space of the root cellar, where the air was thick with the smell of old earth and dust. She fell hard onto the cold concrete, the skin on her elbows tearing. The heavy oak door slammed shut, cutting off the dim yellow light from the basement bulb. She heard the heavy, metallic slide of the iron bolt on the outside. She threw herself against the wood, her fists striking the unyielding timber, but it offered only a dull, mocking thud in return. Absolute darkness swallowed the room. She felt the cold of the concrete seeping into her bones, and the air felt heavy and stagnant. A tomb Thomas had chosen for her spirit. Thomas's voice drifted through the thick wood of the door, vibrating with a low, terrifying calm. He spoke slowly, tasting each word with a cruel deliberation. He informed her that the Jubilee Provel would be her final day in the house. She heard him describe the tragic breakdown he would share with the congregation, a narrative that would justify her permanent disappearance. He planned to commit her to the St. Jude Asylum, a place where the walls were thick and the forgotten stayed forgotten. Evelyn pressed her ear to the cold wood, listening to him tap a rhythmic, playful beat against the door, like a carpenter finishing a coffin. His footsteps faded into the distance, leaving her in a silence that felt like a weight. Evelyn sat on the freezing floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. From somewhere above, through the thick floor joists, she heard the faint, heartbreaking sound of Isaac's crying and the terrified whispers of the children. She flinched as a heavy, grinding sound echoed through the house. Thomas was dragging the massive oak sideboard across the front door, barricading the exit. The rhythmic thud of a hammer driving nails into wood vibrated through the foundation. She realized he was sealing the house, turning the mansion into a fortress for the duration of the Jubilee. Every strike of the hammer felt like a nail in her own coffin. In the blackness, she could hear only her own jagged breathing and the dry scuttle of rats in the corners. Evelyn crawled across the grime-slicked floor, her fingers tracing the rough stone walls of the cellar. She pushed through a pile of collapsed cardboard boxes, her hands finding a flat, wooden surface hidden behind the debris. She cleared away the trash and felt the cold metal of a brass ring. It was the door to the old laundry chute, a relic of the house's original construction that had been boarded up for decades. She yanked on the ring, and the wood groaned in protest before swinging open. A cloud of ancient dust and cobwebs hit her face. She peered into the narrow, vertical shaft, where a thin sliver of light from the upper floors illuminated the thick, frayed hemp ropes of the manual pulley system. It was a path, narrow and dangerous, but hidden from Thomas's cameras. Evelyn squeezed her body into the tight, suffocating space of the shaft, the bricks pressing against her ribs. She gripped the rough rope and began to pull herself upward. The hemp bit into her palms, stripping the skin away in raw ribbons. Warm blood slicked the rope, making her grip precarious. She wedged her feet against the crumbling mortar, climbing inch by agonizing inch. Dust filled her lungs, forcing her to swallow down a cough that threatened to choke her. Her muscles screamed with the effort, and the rope swayed, banging her body against the jagged edges of the brickwork. She saw a thin line of light above her and moved toward it, leaving dark, wet smears of herself on the walls of the chute. Evelyn threw her weight against the small service hatch, and it burst open, spilling her onto the cold tile of the kitchen floor. She gasped for air, the room smelling of stale coffee and floor wax. Through the window, she saw Thomas, dressed in his black Sunday finery, roughly shoving Isaac and the other children into the back of the sedan. He slammed the door and did a final circuit of the car, checking the locks. Evelyn huddled below the level of the windowsill, her heart thumping wildly against her ribs. The gravel crunched under the tires as the car pulled away, heading toward the church for the Jubilee. She realized she had only minutes before he returned or noticed the empty cellar. Evelyn ran into the wreckage of the nursery and grabbed the teddy bear from the floor. She felt the hard, reassuring shape of the dictaphone inside its belly. Every door in the house was sealed from the outside, but she sprinted toward the garage through the internal breezeway. Among Thomas's neatly arranged tools, she found Isaac's old bicycle with its flat tires. She used a heavy pipe wrench to smash the small, reinforced window of the garage door, the glass showering the concrete. She threw the bear through the opening first. With a desperate, painful effort, she squeezed her body through the jagged frame, the glass snagging her dress and tearing at her skin as she tumbled into the driveway. Evelyn ran across the shimmering black asphalt of the main road, the heat rising in waves that made her feet burn with a sharp, stinging intensity. Her soles were caked with gray dust and nicked by the sharp gravel of the shoulder. The air above the road vibrated, turning the distant columns of the church into a shifting, unstable mirage. She clutched the teddy bear to her chest, the hard plastic of the hidden device pressing into her bruised ribs. Sweat stung her eyes, mixing with the grime on her face. The hem of her ruined dress whipped against her bloodied calves. The white spire of the church grew larger, and she forced her legs to move faster, ignoring the rhythmic throb of pain, until the low hum of the crowd ahead became a tangible roar. Evelyn shoved the heavy side door open, and the sudden, cool air of the stone vestibule hit her like a wave. The space smelled of incense and the expensive floral perfumes of the town's elite. She dove behind a heavy velvet curtain, the thick fabric scratching her face as she hid in the folds. Through a narrow gap, she saw Thomas standing on the raised pulpit, bathed in the blinding glare of the television lights. The lenses of the cameras glinted like the eyes of predators. Thomas threw his arms wide toward the vaulted ceiling, his voice booming through the speakers and vibrating in Evelyn's very bones. She held her breath, remaining perfectly still, as he spoke of the sacred, unbreakable bonds of the family. While his massive shadow danced across the walls like a dark, predatory bird, her fingers found the cold iron railing of the narrow spiral staircase leading to the sound booth. The metal was slick with condensation and her own sweat. She climbed upward, placing each foot with a soft, calculated care to avoid the metallic ring of the steps. Below, near the main entrance, security guards in dark suits stood like statues. She could see the backs of their heads, their attention fixed on Thomas's hypnotic performance. One of the guards nodded in synchronization with Thomas's words about the sanctity of the home. Evelyn froze halfway up the stairs as a step groaned under her weight. She pressed her back against the cool stone wall, feeling the low-frequency vibration of Thomas's voice through the masonry. The pastor's assistant turned suddenly at the very door of the radio booth, his glasses flashing in the dim light of the upper hallway. He opened his mouth to shout, but Evelyn acted with a primal, desperate speed. Her hand closed around a heavy bronze candlestick on a side table. She lunged forward, the metal striking the assistant's temple with a sickening, muffled thud. He slumped to the floor, his shoulder hitting the doorframe as he slid down. Evelyn stood over him, her breath coming in jagged gasps, staring at his motionless form. The candlestick felt impossibly heavy in her hand, her fingers locked in a cramp. She stepped over him and shoved the door to the broadcast center open. Evelyn dug her nails into the rough seam of the teddy bear's stomach, ripping the fabric open. White tufts of stuffing exploded across the control console, settling on the glowing buttons and sliders. She yanked the black dictaphone from the toy's interior. Her hands shook as she fumbled for the correct patch cable among the tangled wires of the soundboard. The metal jack clicked into the microphone input of the town-wide broadcast system. Through the soundproof glass of the booth, she watched Thomas on the stage, his face contorted in a mask of oratorical ecstasy. A red indicator light on the console flickered to life. She hovered her finger over the play button, the electric hum of the equipment vibrating in time with her own frantic pulse. Evelyn slammed the master fader for the pulpit microphone down, and Thomas's voice was instantly cut off. A heavy, unnatural silence fell over the crowded sanctuary. Thomas looked down at his microphone, tapping the casing, the sound echoing in the hall as a series of hollow thumps. Evelyn pressed the play button on the small device. A sharp hiss of tape filled the church. She watched Thomas freeze as the first sounds of his own voice, recorded in the absolute privacy of his study, began to play. Evelyn pressed her palms against the cold glass of the booth, watching as a single bead of sweat tracked down Thomas's forehead, while his own confident words of betrayal began to fill the room. From the speakers, a raspy, clear recording of Thomas began to play, his voice casually listing the exact amounts of the stolen church funds. The sound was monstrously loud, reaching into every corner of the nave. When the recording shifted to Thomas's graphic description of how he would dispose of his wife, a wave of audible shock rippled through the pews. People stood up, their faces pale as they looked at the man standing paralyzed at the altar. Thomas looked small and pathetic as his own voice thundered through the rafters. Evelyn saw the television crews frantically re-aiming their cameras toward the speakers. The words of his death threats vibrated in the air, stripping the mask of holiness from his face in front of a live, national audience. Evelyn pushed the door open and stepped onto the small balcony of the radio booth, which hung directly over the congregation. The harsh glare of the spotlights immediately found her. A collective gasp of horror rose from the crowd as they looked up. Evelyn stood perfectly still, allowing the light to reveal the dark bruises on her neck and the raw skin of her shoulders. Her dress hung in tatters, revealing the deep scratches from her escape. She raised her hands, and the dried blood from the laundry chute glinted under the lamps. She didn't say a word, but her shattered appearance and the visible trembling of her frame spoke with a power no recording could match. She looked directly into the lens of the nearest camera, presenting the world with the living evidence of Thomas's brutality. Thomas let out a guttural, animalistic roar and charged toward the stairs leading to the balcony. The tails of his black robe flared behind him like the wings of a scavenger. He vaulted over the floral arrangements at the edge of the altar, his boots crushing the white lilies. Sheriff Miller stepped into his path, blocking the way to the stairs. Thomas tried to shove the lawman aside, but Miller's grip on the pastor's elbow was absolute. The sheriff glanced at the forest of cameras and the glowing red tally lights of the live broadcast. Miller's face turned to stone. He shook his head slowly, pinning Thomas in place. Evelyn watched as Thomas bared his teeth in a snarl, but his power was evaporating with every second he remained under the scrutiny of the press. The parishioners moved in a solid, human wall, surrounding Thomas and cutting him off from the stairs. Evelyn saw a forest of hands that no longer sought a blessing, but instead pushed him back into the center of the floor. Thomas spun within the circle, screaming curses that were drowned out by the rising roar of the crowd's indignation. Sheriff Miller pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. The sharp, mechanical click as they locked around Thomas's wrist sounded like a final, definitive sentence. Evelyn watched as the deputies forced Thomas's arms behind his back. The pride in his posture vanished, his shoulders slumping as he was led toward the side exit under the jeers of the people who had knelt before him that very morning. Evelyn descended into the chaos of the main hall. Isaac and the other children were huddled in the front row, their small bodies pressed into the plush fabric of the seats. She reached them and held out her hands. Isaac immediately lunged for her, his fingers cold and trembling as he gripped her palm. She led the children toward the main doors, a path opening for them through the swarm of shouting reporters. The strobe-like flashes of the cameras blinded her, but she kept her head high, refusing to hide her face. From behind her came the muffled, fading screams of Thomas as he was shoved into a patrol car. Evelyn didn't slow down, and she didn't look back. She felt the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary swing shut behind her, finally sealing away the past and the hollow echoes of Thomas's rage.